Be careful, everybody be careful.
Were you surprised by the CBO score, sir?
Not surprised at all. Only in Washington, when you cut spending, do they call it an increase in the deficit.
I want to make sure you heard what the new Republican Speaker Mike Johnson just said. Quote, only in Washington, when you cut spending, do they call it an increase in the deficit. Right, and only in Washington do otherwise well-educated people pretend to be stupid for the express purpose of manipulating their own supporters while simultaneously doing the bidding of their billionaire donors. If Mike Johnson's take was any more disingenuous, I think my eyes would have rolled into the back of my head and stayed there. Here's the deal. The first major piece of legislation introduced by Mike Johnson was an emergency aid bill to Israel providing $14.3 billion in funding, while stripping that same amount from IRS funding that was allocated as part of the Inflation Reduction Act. And already, right there, it puts on full display the partisan hackery that Johnson's engaging in. He claims to care so much about Israel, and yet the only way he's willing to actually support that country, that, again, he claims to care about, is by stripping money from the IRS, which is being used to audit wealthy tax cheats. That's the message that Republicans are sending. We'll help Israel, but only if our rich donors can cheat on their taxes. How's that for a working class message? How's that for their Israel bona fides? I'd venture to say not great on either count. So already just conditioning that aid shows that Republicans don't really give a shit about Israel, because if they did, they wouldn't condition its aid release on a completely unrelated matter. But here's where it gets especially absurd. Funding the IRS actually generates revenue for the government, meaning the deficit goes down. For every dollar that you fund the IRS, you bring in roughly $2. You don't have to be an economist to recognize that that is a pretty good return. By that same token, eliminating IRS funding will actually increase the deficit because we lose out on recouping that tax revenue from tax cheats. That was borne out today when the Congressional Budget Office released their score, showing that the move would likely add $26 billion to the deficit. So when Mike Johnson smugly says, only in Washington when you cut spending do they call it an increase in the deficit, he is flat out lying and he knows it. When you cut spending to an agency whose job is to recoup tax revenue, then guess what? Our revenue goes down and the deficit goes up. So it's not only in Washington where that happens, it is anywhere where you have even a cursory understanding of very basic math. It also shows that, per usual, Republicans don't care about the deficit. I want to repeat that so that no one misses it. Republicans do not care about the deficit. That is a thing they say because they like the way it sounds. But if on their very first bill with the new speaker, they're moving to add to the deficit, we're not even talking about deficit neutral, we're talking about spending $14 billion on Israel and eliminating $26 billion in revenue from the IRS, then on no planet do they actually care about this issue. They didn't even give themselves plausible deniability with some little 1% cut here or there. They've just barreled right ahead and introduced a bill adding tens of billions of dollars to the deficit because they do not care. Just like they didn't care when they added $7.8 trillion to the debt when Trump was president and Republicans had full control of government. Just like they didn't care when their only legislative accomplishment during that time was a tax cut for millionaires and billionaires that cost us $1.9 trillion according to the Congressional Budget Office. I don't know how many times we need to watch them rack up billions and trillions of dollars of spending for their rich cronies before it becomes clear that no matter how many times they call themselves fiscally conservative, quite literally nothing they do is fiscally conservative. Now, as for Johnson's pet project to help out tax cheats, it's facing some serious headwinds, considering it's guaranteed to go nowhere in the Senate or the White House. White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre issued a statement saying, quote, politicizing our national security interests is a non-starter, demanding offsets for meeting core national security needs of the United States, like supporting Israel and defending Ukraine from atrocities and Russian imperialism, would be a break with the normal bipartisan process and could have devastating implications for our safety and alliances in the years ahead. The chair of the Senate Finance Committee, Ron Wyden, echoed those claims, saying that Johnson's plan is horrifying and a non-starter in the Senate. I'm going to fight it, and I'm going to use every tool I have as chairman of the Finance Committee to do it. Even Senate Republicans are pushing back on this bill.
The reason we have the IRS is to make sure people pay their taxes. That's our source of revenue. So the idea that we're going to save money by having fewer people checking on whether we're paying our taxes or not doesn't make a lot of sense. If we're going to have a piece of legislation that actually becomes law, it's going to include support for Ukraine as well as Israel.
I'd love to cut the IRS. So we're going to cut something? By all means, let's cut the IRS. But let's get Israel aid done. That would be my first priority.
I'm not against offsets if you can find one, but I wouldn't want to see an offset, even though I'm in favor of this offset because it goes after the IRS. I would not ever want to see an offset be the reason why we don't provide urgently needed assistance.
I support the package staying together. I think Secretary Blinken and Austin gave a good answer of why we should not break it apart.
And frankly, this bill may not even make it that far. Even some House Republicans are pushing back. Chip Roy, a Republican congressman from Texas, said that Israel aid should be paid for, and it should be paid for with real money, not budgetary gimmicks. And I gotta say, when the bullshit meter starts going off with House Republicans, you know you might have lost the plot. So if you were wondering what kind of a speaker Mike Johnson would be, you just got your answer. This guy stands for nothing. He claims to care about Israel, but apparently not enough to allow what he himself calls an emergency bill to actually stand alone. He claims to care about the deficit, but apparently not enough to do anything to actually lower it. His words exist completely independent of his actions. But you gotta give him credit on one thing, at least he's consistent. Because for years, Republicans have broadcast that their sole priority isn't regular Americans. It's not the working class, it's not raising wages, it's not cutting costs, it's not improving our healthcare or our schools or our infrastructure. It is helping their rich donors. That's it. Anything they do and everything they do is in service of the richest among us. The only people who would benefit from this bill are Americans making over $400,000 per year, which is the only group that the IRS is targeting with audit increases. So it doesn't take a detective to figure out who they're helping by trying to strip that funding away. So they may parade themselves around as if they're these working class champions, but aside from lip service, Republicans are not willing to lift a finger for anyone not in the top 1%. In this case, it's not just the top 1% they're helping, but the top 1% who are cheating on their taxes. The same people who refuse to pay what they owe, while the rest of us all have to follow the rules. That means that Republicans, led by Mike Johnson, are endorsing these people not funding our police, not funding our firemen, not funding our schools, not funding our roads. We all have to follow the rules. We all have to pay our taxes. We all have to fund these things, and yet the richest Americans who want to cheat on their taxes don't, and they have the full support of Republicans in Congress. There are two classes of people in this country. Republicans and their rich donors are in one, and they want everyone else in the other. So no, Mike Johnson is not a new kind of Republican. He's not a fiscal conservative. He is not an adult in the room. He is exactly what those far-right members of the House GOP angled for, a morally bankrupt liar whose sole function is to shill for the ultra-rich under the guise of fiscal responsibility. There are no lengths he won't go to while protecting his donors, and we're seeing that play out in real time. Before you go, I need some help. Please subscribe to the channel and do your part to help grow the progressive media ecosystem. I don't do sponsorships or paid ads, I won't ask for money, but just subscribing to this channel goes a really long way, and it helps get the message out to more people. The subscribe button is right here on this screen. You can also subscribe to my Spanish language channel, which I made to reach those crucial Spanish-speaking voters. That link is on the screen too. And finally, if you want to listen to my audio podcast, you can follow that link as well. Thanks so much for watching.